The legendary Dick Van Dyke and why he's especially grateful.
These guys I owe my life to and my house to. So God bless you guys.
Some men entertain a generation. Others entertain a century. Dick Van Dyke has always belonged to that rarer, almost mythical second category. For over 7 decades, his name has carried a meaning that words struggle to fully hold: pure joy. The kind that asks nothing in return and leaves no room for cynicism. That extraordinary face, capable of contorting into 1,000 different emotions within a single breath. That body, moving through the world as though the laws of physics were open to negotiation. And that laugh, wide, warm, and completely unstoppable, erupting before the punchline even landed, as if laughter were not something he performed but something he simply was. He gave all of it away freely, to audiences in theaters, to families gathered around television sets, to children who needed magic and found it in him. And the world received that gift without ever fully grasping what it had taken to give it. He swept across rain-soaked London rooftops. He tumbled over living room furniture in households across America. He transformed soot-covered chimney sweeps into unlikely sages and persuaded generations of children that a spoonful of sugar could make the impossible feel manageable. His gift looked effortless, and that effortlessness was itself the greatest illusion he ever performed. But here is what very few people ever thought to ask: what did it cost him? Because behind that grin, behind the rubber legs and the infectious warmth, lived a man whose private story was never as bright as the one he performed. There is a chapter of his life that almost no one knew about for decades, something he kept buried beneath the applause and the accolades. And when it finally came to light, it reframed everything. We will get there. And when we do, it will change the way you see all of it. This is that story. Richard Wayne Van Dyke arrived in the world on December 13, 1925, in West Plains, Missouri, a small, dust-settled town where the Great Depression wasn't a headline but a lived reality. It didn't descend like a storm. It settled slowly, like a fog that refused to lift, pressing itself into every corner of daily life. His father, Loren, was the kind of man who did not have the luxury of a single profession. He sold things, hauled things, worked whatever the moment demanded, a man held together not by comfort but by an absolute refusal to stop. His mother, Hazel, was quieter in nature but no less determined, managing the household with a grace that never once let hardship become an excuse or an identity. When Dick was still a young boy, the family moved to Danville, Illinois. And it was there, in the wide-open flatness of the American Midwest, that something in him began to surface. The boy was funny. Not in the way children are sometimes funny, accidentally, fleetingly. He was funny in the way that certain people simply are, as though humor had been threaded through his very construction. He twisted his face into expressions that made adults lose their composure completely. He reproduced radio personalities with an accuracy that bordered on unnerving. He performed for anyone who would watch: neighbors, classmates, strangers, and discovered at an early age that laughter was the one currency that never depreciated, no matter how grim the times became. Academically, school held little for him. He was not a student. He was a performer with no stage yet assigned to him. He poured every ounce of that restless energy into drama clubs, speech programs, and community theater. Anywhere that would have him, anywhere he could be seen and heard. Danville gave him something that money could not have purchased, an early audience that believed in him before he had given them any real reason to. Then history intervened. In 1944, at 18 years old, with the Second World War consuming the globe and an entire generation of young men marching toward uncertainty, Dick Van Dyke walked into a recruitment office and attempted to enlist in the United States Army Air Forces as a pilot. The desire was genuine. The urgency was real. But the military looked at this tall, angular young man built, it seemed, for pratfalls rather than combat, and delivered a flat rejection. He did not meet the weight requirements for pilot training. It stung, but the Army found another use for him. Reclassified and redirected, he spent the war years stateside, traveling from base to base as a radio announcer and entertainer, performing for troops who were exhausted, frightened, and longing for anything that felt like home. It was not glamorous duty. It was not the front. But night after night, standing before rooms full of men carrying fears they could not name, Dick Van Dyke absorbed a truth that no classroom could have taught him. Comedy was not entertainment. It was survival. It was the thing that reminded people, even briefly, that they were still human. When civilian life resumed after the war, he was 20 years old and professionally unqualified for almost everything, except the one thing that had never felt like a choice: performing. There was simply no alternative version of himself that he could imagine. The stage was not an ambition. It was a conclusion he had reached before he was old enough to question it. What followed was a long and often brutal education in the reality of show business. He worked local radio in Atlanta. He formed a pantomime comedy duo called the Merry Mutes, and he and his partner toured nightclub circuits and variety venues across the country with the particular brand of optimism that belongs only to people who have not yet been beaten down enough to stop. Bookings were inconsistent. Pay was unreliable. Some nights, the audience was barely paying attention. Other nights, there was almost no audience at all. In 1948, he married Margie Willett, a woman he had known since his earliest years in Danville. In its beginning, the marriage was built on genuine love and nearly nothing else. They moved where work took them, raised their family in rented rooms and borrowed time, and built a life in the in-between spaces of a career that had not yet decided to arrive. 4 children came. The weight of responsibility grew heavier, and still Dick Van Dyke refused to walk away from the thing he knew he was. His break, when it finally came, did not announce itself with fanfare. Real breaks rarely do. It came through sheer, sustained persistence, a television variety spot in New Orleans, then New York, then in 1955, a regular role on CBS's The Morning Show as comedian and announcer. The camera did something with his face that no director had to engineer. It simply fell in love with him. He was not someone the lens tolerated. He was someone it sought out. Broadway followed. In 1960, he landed the lead in Bye Bye Birdie, a full musical requiring everything he possessed: precision footwork, physical comedy, unshakable timing, and an effortless magnetism that made every other performer on stage want to lean toward him. He gave the role everything he had. The American theater community responded with a Tony Award for Best Actor in a Musical. The boy from Danville, the one who had failed a military physical and toured empty rooms for years, he was no longer possible to ignore. The world was about to say his name in a way it would never stop saying. There are careers that climb carefully, methodically, one deliberate rung at a time. And then there are careers that simply explode. Dick Van Dyke's exploded. In 1961, Carl Reiner, one of the most precise comic minds of his generation, was building a television show around the life of a television writer. A man navigating the collision of his professional world and his domestic one, with all the chaos and warmth that collision produced. Reiner had originally written the central role for himself. Then, with the wisdom of someone who understood exactly what a show needed, he stepped aside. He needed someone capable of holding every contradictory quality at once: physical comedy and genuine warmth, professional credibility and lovable fallibility, the ability to be absolutely ridiculous without ever losing the audience's respect. That specific combination of qualities was, by any reasonable measure, nearly impossible to find in a single person. He found Dick Van Dyke. The Dick Van Dyke Show premiered on CBS on October 3, 1961. Within 2 seasons, it had ceased being a television program and become something closer to a national ritual. Rob Petrie, the character Dick inhabited with such complete conviction, was unlike anything American audiences had seen before. A husband who was funny without being diminished. A professional who was capable without being stiff. a man whose stumbles and missteps made people adore him rather than pity him. He tripped over that ottoman every single week in the opening credits. And every single week, America laughed as though it were the first time they had ever seen it. Now, and this matters, pay attention to what was happening behind the scenes during those celebrated years. Because even as the Emmys accumulated and the audience numbers climbed, something in Dick Van Dyke's private life was quietly fracturing. Something that the cameras never caught and the studio lights never illuminated. We'll come back to it. The show ran for 5 seasons. It collected 15 Emmy Awards in total. Dick personally won 5 of them. But those figures, remarkable as they are, cannot fully contain what those years actually produced. What they produced was a new standard, not one standard among several, but the standard. The singular benchmark against which American television comedy would measure itself for the next several decades. His castmates spoke about him with something beyond admiration. Mary Tyler Moore, who played his wife Laura Petrie, reflected years later that working alongside Dick Van Dyke had been the finest comedic education she could have received. He never held credit tightly. He never delivered a performance at less than full effort. He was, by every account, incapable of going through the motions, not because he was rigid or intense, but because performing at full capacity was simply the only way he knew how to exist on a set. Every single episode was treated as though it genuinely mattered, because to him, it did. He understood, with the hard-earned instinct of a man who had once performed for nearly empty rooms, that an audience's trust is never automatic. It has to be earned week after week, without exception. Then Hollywood came calling. In 1964, Walt Disney personally requested Dick Van Dyke for the role of Bert the Chimney Sweep in Mary Poppins. Disney did not make such requests lightly. He chose faces capable of carrying real emotional weight while never losing the lightness that made audiences feel safe. Dick Van Dyke, with his elastic physicality and his seemingly bottomless instinct for joy, was exactly what Disney had in mind. The film became one of the most beloved in cinema history. The rooftop dance sequence with the animated penguins, choreographed and executed with a precision that looked like pure spontaneous delight, remains one of the most technically remarkable pieces of physical comedy ever captured on film. Mary Poppins earned 13 Academy Award nominations and won 5 Oscars. Dick Van Dyke delivered a performance of such warmth and physical brilliance that it transcended every question of dialect authenticity, including what he would later cheerfully describe as the worst Cockney accent in the history of cinema. The British, eventually, forgave him. Some even came to love it. But summits always exact their toll. What the cameras captured in those gleaming years was the performance. What they did not capture was the cost. The shooting schedules were merciless. The television series filmed year-round. Film commitments, public appearances, and the relentless machinery of celebrity consumed whatever hours remained. And in the gaps, in hotel rooms and dressing rooms and the long silences between obligations, Dick Van Dyke had begun reaching for something that temporarily softened the edges of a life that, from the outside, looked perfect. Alcohol. Not dramatically at first, quietly socially, the way it begins for most people who eventually find themselves in its grip. Relief, reward, the thing that filled the space between performances. His marriage to Margie, the woman who had stood beside him through every lean and abundant year, was quietly unraveling under pressures that fame accelerates rather than resolves. 4 children, a beautiful home, every outward measure of success. And still the fault lines widened. The man who made the world laugh was losing himself in the shadow of that laughter. Through the late 1960s and into the 70s, the work continued. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang arrived in 1968, lavish, eccentric, and warmly received. Television welcomed him back. Awards kept coming. The name still carried weight. But weight carried long enough becomes burden. The drinking was no longer occasional. It had become structural, woven into the daily architecture of his life in ways that were visible to everyone around him long before he was willing to see it himself. His performances remained professional. His discipline was too deeply ingrained to allow public collapse, but privately, the man behind the performances was diminishing. His 30-year marriage to Margie ended in 1976, not as a single dramatic rupture, but as the formal acknowledgement of a distance that had been growing for years. Dick would later speak of it with quiet sorrow, not bitterness, not blame. Sometimes, he said, two people simply become strangers to each other, and no amount of shared history can reverse the drift. By the early 1980s, the drinking had become impossible to minimize or ignore. He checked himself into treatment, a decision that required the particular courage that only arrives when a person has exhausted every alternative and faced the full weight of what they are losing. He never dramatized it. He never weaponized it for sympathy. In interviews years later, he spoke about the addiction with careful, direct honesty, acknowledged the damage, made no excuses, and told the truth the same way he had always delivered his best work. Sobriety, when it came, arrived not as a thunderclap but as a daily decision repeated until it became identity. He rebuilt, quietly, without fanfare, with the same stubborn persistence that had once carried him from the nightclubs of Atlanta to the rooftops of London. And then unexpectedly, love returned. In 1976, the same year his marriage ended, Dick had begun a relationship with Michelle Traiola, an actress and entertainer who would remain his devoted companion for more than 3 decades. They never married, choosing instead a partnership built on genuine devotion rather than legal formality. She stood beside him through the recovery years, through the career's second and third chapters, through the slow and careful rebuilding of a life that addiction had come dangerously close to dismantling. She was, by every account, his anchor. When Michelle Traiola died in 2009 after a battle with lung cancer, Dick Van Dyke was 83 years old. He had already outlived contemporaries, collaborators, and close friends whose absences had accumulated into a particular kind of loneliness only the very old truly understand. But Michelle's death was different. It was intimate in a way that public loss is not. He grieved quietly, not performing it, not publicizing it, carrying it with the dignity of a man who understands that grief is simply the price of love, and who would pay it again without a moment's hesitation. He was still standing, scarred, sober, and sorrowful, but standing. Then, at 86 years old, something no one expected happened. He met Arlene Silver. It was 2011 at the Screen Actors Guild Awards. Arlene was 40 years old, working the event as a makeup artist. By every conventional measure, the encounter should have been forgettable. Instead, something ignited. Their 46-year age difference became immediate tabloid material. Critics questioned the connection. The machinery of celebrity gossip attempted, as it always does, to reduce what it could not understand. They refused to be reduced. Those who observed them together described something that simply resisted cynical interpretation. Arlene brought back into Dick's life the one quality that had been missing since Michelle's passing: genuine, daily, unguarded joy. Not the performed joy of a man fulfilling public obligations. The private joy of someone who has been found, at exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person. They married in 2012. He was 86. She was 40. The wedding was small, attended by those who recognized what they were witnessing, not a curiosity or a scandal, but a love story in its simplest and most honest form. He would later say, without any theatrical flourish, that Arlene saved his life. Not metaphorically, practically. She reorganized his health, encouraged his movement, kept him socially and creatively engaged at an age when isolation becomes its own slow danger. She understood, instinctively, that for a man whose entire existence had been built on movement and connection, Stillness was the real threat. And so he kept moving. Into his 90s, Dick Van Dyke remained one of the most recognizable and genuinely beloved figures in American entertainment. He danced carefully, joyfully. He sang. He laughed. He showed up. Videos of him moving and performing spread across the internet with the speed of things that remind people why they fell in love with someone in the first place. But time is the one opponent that nobody defeats. In his late 90s, the physical realities of extreme age began to accumulate in ways that no amount of discipline, devotion, or love could entirely hold back. The body that had been his primary instrument for 8 decades, the body that danced with animated penguins, tumbled over ottomans, and moved through the world with a fluidity that bordered on the supernatural, began, at last, to impose its limits. Mobility became increasingly difficult. The legs that had carried him across every stage imaginable now required assistance they had never once needed before. A neurological condition affecting his balance, combined with the honest weight of a century of living, changed the landscape of his daily existence in ways that were visible and undeniable. Steps became deliberate. Distances required planning. Walking, which had once been simply the beginning of every dance, became its own careful negotiation with gravity. For a man whose entire identity had been inseparable from physical movement, this was not a small loss. It was the loss of the language he had spoken most fluently his entire life. The body that had communicated joy, absurdity, and humanity to hundreds of millions of people across 7 decades was no longer fully his to command. And yet those closest to him described not a man diminished, but a man transformed, quieter, more deliberate, perhaps more honest than even the most brilliant performances that came before. Arlene remains beside him, constant and devoted. His children and grandchildren surround him with the particular tenderness reserved for those we cannot imagine losing. And he still laughs. Those who visit say it arrives exactly as it always did, before the punchline, generous and unstoppable, as though laughter remains his native language even when so much else has changed. 100 years is not simply a number. It is the full weight of everything a life can hold: triumph and ruin, love and loss, laughter given freely and grief carried quietly. It is the sum of every desperate decision and every grace of old choice. It is the faces of everyone you have outlived and the warmth of everyone still beside you. Dick Van Dyke has lived all of it. He arrived during the roar of the 1920s. He survived the silence of the Depression, served his country in wartime, and built something extraordinary from a pantomime act nobody remembered and a television show nobody will ever forget. He danced on rooftops and stumbled over ottomans and made a planet full of strangers feel, for the length of a performance, that joy was not merely possible, it was inevitable. He fell into addiction, into loneliness, into the particular darkness that fame deposits in its quiet wake, and he climbed back out not once but repeatedly with the stubbornness of a man who simply refuses to accept that his story is finished. He lost people who were irreplaceable. He found love when the world had long since decided he was too old for it. He rebuilt himself from materials that lesser men would have abandoned entirely. And now at 100 he sits with the stillness that extreme age imposes, his body bearing the honest record of a century fully lived, and he laughs, still, generously, without apology. The world sometimes frames his story as a tragedy, the image of a dancer who can no longer dance. But that framing misses the deeper truth entirely. The real tragedy, if we must use that word, is not what he has lost. It is what the world almost failed to notice while he still had it. The effortlessness that was never truly effortless. The joy that was never accidental. The decades of discipline and devotion hidden behind every performance that looked, from the audience, like pure natural gift. What a century teaches, if we are willing to learn from it, is this: the body is temporary, but the work endures. Love found at any age is never too late. Survival is not a passive condition but an active choice, made again every single morning. And the greatest performances are not always delivered under stage lights. Sometimes the greatest performance is simply continuing. Dick Van Dyke continues. And for that, the world owes him not sympathy, but gratitude. If this story moved you the way it moved us, if you found something in it worth holding onto, then take a moment right now and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. And if you are new to Celebrity Insider, this is exactly what we do here. We go beyond the highlights and the headlines. We tell the full story, the struggle behind the success, the silence behind the applause, the real lives behind the famous faces. If that is the kind of storytelling you want more of, subscribe to Celebrity Insider right now and make sure you never miss another one. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what part of Dick Van Dyke's story stayed with you. We read every single one, and your voice genuinely shapes the stories we tell next. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to rebuild, to love again, to keep moving forward. We will see you in the next one.